Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program, the 1943 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Resistance and Survival in the Holocaust. Thank you for joining us to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope you will visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibition, Survivors' Faces of Life After the Holocaust, from photographer Barton Scholler. You can learn more and find tickets on our website. We also appreciate the vital support of our members so much here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to all the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Zachary Mazur. Dr. Mazur earned his PhD at Yale University and is currently a senior historian at the POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. His research interests are in 20th century East Central Europe, national identity, law, and economics. I would also like to thank the POLIN Museum for co-presenting today's program. And thank you all so much for joining us today. And now I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Mazur.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thank you to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Thank you to Sydney Yeager and Josh Mack, who I met with as well. And help make this happen. So thank you to everyone for that. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as you know. Just going to start sharing my screen now. And we'll make sure that this works. Sydney, just give me a signal that this is full screen.
You're good to go.
Great, thank you. So I do want to talk about a little bit about why the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is important, why it's become such an important symbol in the history of the Holocaust. Here we have a picture of the brand new exhibition at the Museum of Jewish History in New York City, which many of you hopefully have visited. If you haven't, then I highly recommend it. But where it starts actually is with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So that in and of itself is perhaps a surprising thing. It's not, it's not the beginning of the Holocaust. It's not the beginning of Nazism, but this is such an important event. Why is that? I think there are a couple of reasons. Obviously, it was it was the largest, in fact, the largest instance of Jewish resistance against the Holocaust. It was also the first urban uprising anywhere against Nazi rule. But I think that for Jews in particular, this event is important because of a stereotype that is continued on, that Jews were passive during the Holocaust, that Jews did not resist for the most part, and that they went to the slaughter like sheep, as some have said. And I think that this is grounded in frankly, an anti-Semitic stereotype about Jews being cowardly, that they don't pick up weapons, that Jews don't fight. And all of this, of course, is very offensive and frankly just not true, right? Like we can find many instances of resistance, and one does not need to pick up a gun to be resisting evil and resisting this system in this case. So today I'm going to talk obviously about armed resistance. That is what the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is all about. But I also want to talk about those other forms of resistance. It's important to keep in mind how many times somebody resisted the Nazi extermination plan, and their resistance was not successful. And so we know nothing about it. We have no record of that. And yet that resistance still matters, and we should still care about that. So I want to talk about both sides of that resistance. But first, we need to sort of get on the same page and understand what this place was, the Warsaw Ghetto. As many of you probably know, Warsaw was a major Jewish metropolis. Before the war, about a third of the city was Jewish, coming up to about 350,000 people. And when the Germans and Soviets invaded in 1939, in September of 1939, that population ballooned. And at its zenith, there were 450,000 Jews living in Warsaw. At the start, the borders were rather fluid. People could move in and out of the ghetto, but Jews had to live in this particular area of the city. And it was huge. It was huge, and it was right in the center of the city. So that's an important part of our story. Then in November of 1940, the ghetto was closed. And there were two reasons given for the closing of the ghetto. One, ironically, was Polish anti-Semitism. They said that they were going to protect the Jews from Polish anti-Semitism by putting up this wall. The other reason that they gave was an epidemic of typhus in particular. And they claimed that because Jews were carriers of disease, that therefore they need to close them up in the ghetto and prevent the spread of disease. And you can see from this particular picture that there are weird cases when buildings were split in half by the wall of the ghetto. The ghetto wall was 4 meters high, so about 13 feet high, very, very tall. Inside the ghetto, there was a struggle really every day to survive. And for Jews in particular, that meant trying to find food and trying to find fuel during the winter. As you can see from the numbers I put up here, there was a racial hierarchy for rationing, and Germans obviously got the most amount of food, and Jews were given a starvation ration. Poles are in the middle, also getting basically a starvation ration, but slightly more food than Jews. And so people took to smuggling, obviously, to make up the difference. And the picture on the right shows a child who was being used to smuggle goods in and out of the ghetto. This was quite common because there were holes made in the ghetto wall, and therefore children were small enough to fit through these holes and could go back and forth, bringing goods outside of the ghetto and then bringing food back in. There are a couple of shots here from a documentary film made by Eric Bednarski called Warsaw, A City Divided. And here we have some images, some unique images from the Polish perspective. His grandfather, in fact, was a Polish man living in Warsaw. He happened to own a car, and he owned a film camera, and he got a permit to drive through the ghetto. And while he was driving through the ghetto, he surreptitiously made this film. And it's a very unique source material that we have, because almost everything that we have from the ghetto is from the German perspective. So it's seen through the eyes of the perpetrator. But here we have something else. We have a different perspective, and these are extremely valuable. And I'll talk more about why these images are valuable later on. But on the left side, we can see more children smuggling, in particular fuel. There's a pile of sticks there in that boy's hand. And on the right side, we have a Polish policeman punishing a boy for smuggling. The Polish police, the so-called blue police, were used in particular for guarding the ghetto wall, but apparently they were easily bribed with 5 to 7 zloty to look the other way. Here, another image from that film, a stark image of a Polish policeman confronting a smuggler. The Holocaust, of course, did not begin in 1939 or in 1940, but really it began with the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union along with its allies, Hungary, Romania, and Italy, and Slovakia too. But at that point, behind the front lines were groups of policemen and reserves, the so-called Einsatzgruppen, who took to gathering up Jews near where they lived and killing them. And this is really when the final solution to the Jewish question, as it was called, began. And I mention this just because a lot of the imagery and the things that we like to think about associated with the Holocaust are not this, but this is really how many Jews who died in the Holocaust died near where they lived, without getting on a train, without going to a camp, without getting in a gas chamber, but being killed by bullets in this way by the Einsatzgruppen. And then by the beginning of 1942, we get to see the system of camps and ghettos that we're more familiar with. And up on the top right, we can see Warsaw, and right near Warsaw is Treblinka. And Treblinka is important because it is where the vast majority of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were taken to be killed. And Treblinka was not a camp like Auschwitz where there was any kind of selection, but Treblinka was exclusively a death camp. Any Jew who was brought there was basically immediately killed within hours of their arrival. And this began, the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto began in July of 1942, the so-called Great Deportation Action. And over those months, over a relatively short period of time, really just 46 days, about 6,000 to 8,000 Jews were brought per day to this spot, to the Umschlagplatz, which is pictured here. Jews were gathered up in this spot and then loaded on trains and then brought to Treblinka to be killed. And this is an important turning point, because this is the point at which people started to organize resistance, organize armed resistance, and organize some kind of violent resistance, let's say, as opposed to other forms of resistance, whether spiritual or smuggling, even as a form of resistance, all kinds of other ways that people resisted. But I want to talk about the mechanics of how this actually happened. So at the top, we have, of course, the famous Nazi Heinrich Himmler, who is in charge of the Gestapo, the secret police, and the SS. The SS was a paramilitary group within the Nazi Party. And both of those organizations were in charge of the Jewish Council, the Judenrat. Every ghetto had a Jewish council. The Jewish council was made up of generally elderly elites within the Jewish community who were following the orders of the German occupiers. The Judenrat then was in control of a Jewish police force within the Warsaw Ghetto, which was made up of about 2,500 people. And that Jewish police force was the actual hands and boots on the ground that were essentially gathering people up and bringing them to Umschlagplatz. So they were doing the dirty work of making the Holocaust happen in this way. And I want to show you this for a very particular reason, because when resistance was finally organized, here we have a picture of Lakin, the head of the Jewish police, the short man there on the left, and an armband from the ghetto police. But when resistance was finally organized, it was directed at these people. It was directed at the Jewish Council, at the Jewish police, and not at the Nazis. So once somebody picked up a gun to take revenge for contributing to the Holocaust, it was directly against these people who were seen as traitors in the first instance. And resistance really started to come together during the Great Deportation Action, as I mentioned, and it had to come together with a union. So it might be surprising to some of you to hear that despite the fact that the conditions of life were very, very difficult in the Warsaw Ghetto and in all of the ghettos, politics carried on. People continued to publish underground newspapers. There was a lot of interest in gathering adherents to political ideologies. And there was a lot of conflict between these parties as well. These are ideological differences that could not be solved, right? For example, the Bundists believed that the place for the Jews was in Europe. And the Zionists obviously believed that the place for Jews was somewhere else, whether it be in Palestine or somewhere else. So these were conflicts that could not be easily resolved. But in the summer of 1942, there was a union of political parties that finally came together in the form of the Jewish Combat Organization that we have pictured here. And they were finally deciding to work together to organize resistance against against the occupiers, against the Nazi death machine. And this group was led by Mordechai Anielewicz, who is pictured there on the left. He was 24 years old at that time. We have Yitzhak Zuckerman and Marek Edelman also pictured here. Zuckerman emigrated to Israel. Marek Edelman spent his life in Poland. Also because of their political proclivities, Yitzhak Zuckerman was a Zionist, obviously, and Marek Edelman was a Bundist. And Mordechai Anielewicz did not survive the uprising. So that is why we only have this younger picture of him. In any case, they did start to organize some resistance, but their efforts were quite limited. And at the end of this period of the Great Deportation action in September 1942, there were about 50,000 people left in the ghetto, 50,000 Jews left in the ghetto. And most people, how they reacted to this situation was to be completely despondent. And I think that we can all understand why. They had lost basically everyone that they had ever known. All of their family, all of their friends were now gone. And many people had lost the will to live or any hope for the future. With the exception, of course, of some of these people, like the Jewish Combat Organization. So then in January of 1943, there was an attempt made to clear the ghetto. So Heinrich Himmler himself actually came to the Warsaw Ghetto on January 9th, 1943, and he ordered that the rest of the ghetto, that those 50,000 remaining inhabitants, be cleared and killed. And so the Germans came through with their police forces, and this time they did not have the Jewish police at their disposal because they had already been killed in Treblinka. So they had to come in themselves. Germans had to come in themselves, and they were met with resistance. They were met with resistance from the Jewish Combat Organization. They were also met with resistance from a group of revisionist Zionists who refused to join the Jewish Combat Organization, called the Jewish Military Union. And so these groups actually put up a fight, much to the surprise of the Germans, because of the anti-Semitic stereotypes that I mentioned at the top. They strongly believed that Jews could not fight, that Jews were cowardly and would not fight. And so they were very, very surprised by the resistance that they met in January of 1943. And the Germans retreated. So they gave up on their initial attempt to clear the ghetto in January 1943. And this was a real turning point. This was a major turning point for attitudes all over the ghetto. All of a sudden, people felt like they had agency. They had the power to change the future. And they started thinking about their own futures, thinking about what they could do next. And what did they do? They started planning bunkers. And here we have a map of some of the bunkers that I'm going to be talking about. These names are people who we're going to meet in a moment. But this is a map from our temporary exhibition, which is specifically about the experience inside these bunkers and living as a civilian through the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the map here is just illustrative to show you the amount of bunkers and how complex they were. So here is a schematic from one of those bunkers, and it shows a secret entrance at the top, a tunnel going down, and then a brick wall that would be on rails so that it could be moved throughout the room, hiding other smaller rooms. And here another plan from Ulica Miła, from Miła Street, that shows the layout of another bunker. I have a long quote here, but it's really important just to give you more of a sense of the amazing activity that was undertaken during this period. So this is coming from an architect, a Jewish architect, obviously named Baruch Goldman. He survived the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and in 1943 and late 1943, he was hiding on the so-called Aryan side of the wall and started to write down his recollection. So he writes this. Towards the end of January, Engineer G approached me to supervise the construction of a shelter for 25 to 30 people who could spend up to 6 months there. The shelter was built under a courtyard with the entrance from one of the basements. The interior was divided into a bedroom, storeroom, kitchen, and common room. Water was to be supplied from 2 water mains, electricity from 2 different transformers. In addition to electric heaters, the kitchen was to be equipped with a coal stove with a flue led underground through a separate vent. Moreover, there was a backup water supply pumped from a well and a backup electric light in the form of a hand-powered 6-volt dynamo. Ventilation was supplied by electric fans and a special system of ducts. The entrance from the basement was camouflaged by a movable wall weighing 2 tons, while the entire dividing wall from the side of the basement was covered with a 3-meter wide chamber completely filled up with sand. The storeroom, apart from food such as biscuits, potatoes, vegetables, and fat, was to hold a stock of candles, kerosene, fuel, soap, and medicines. All of the outdoor and much of the inside work was completed by the end of February 1943, at which point the collection of food began. And I want to just emphasize there the timing. I mentioned this, this attempt in mid-January to clear the ghetto, and that changes things. That gives people hope. And then by the end of February, so he's saying basically within a month, from the end of January to the end of February, and February is a short month, within a month, they managed to do all of this. They managed to do all of this while starving, to do all of this without attracting attention from the Germans. It's really, really unbelievable stuff that they managed to do all of this. And of course, their hope, as he says, he's looking to spend 6 months there. Their hope is that the Germans will lose, right? They're thinking, as many people did, the war is not going well for Hitler. And it really wasn't going well. And many people thought that they would capitulate pretty soon. Few people would guess that it would go on so long that the Germans would not want to give up. But in any case, this was their hope, that the war would end and they would be freed. And they could just survive in hiding for that period of time. So people are preparing for the future, thinking about their ability to hide in these bunkers and wait out the end of the war. And then on the 19th of April, 1943, the Germans come back. And the Germans come back, this time much more heavily armed than before, much more better prepared than before. They had machine guns, flamethrowers, small cannons, armored cars, and tanks, all entering the ghetto on the 19th of April. And much to their surprise, again, they met a heavy, heavy resistance. The group that I had mentioned before, the revisionist Zionists who refused to join the Jewish Combat Organization, they had managed to steal or purchase a heavy machine gun themselves and stood really at the center of the ghetto and fought off the Germans for 3 days before the surviving members of that group escaped through the sewers. None of them survived until the end of the war, so we actually know very little about them. The Jewish Combat Organization, as I mentioned, was the largest group. They had over 500 members, and they were led, as I mentioned, by Anja Levich, and they were all over the ghetto and were working well together, were well harmonized in their communications, and really did an excellent job fighting off the German attack. Meanwhile, inside the bunkers, life carried on. Paula Rothschild writes, on the 19th, we were busy with the preparations for the Seder. All of a sudden, someone knocked on the door and informed us in a muffled voice that there was going to be a pogrom in the ghetto. And the 19th of April was the day before Passover in 1943. So people were preparing themselves for Passover when all of a sudden the Germans attacked. Leon Nyberg writes, we must now hide in shelters, tombs until the end of the war. Like I mentioned, this was the hope that they would be able to hide in these shelters, but he was feeling himself to be already trapped in what he called a tomb. Stella Fiddlestead wrote, in the first days of combat, we were completely cut off from the other houses, and we didn't know there was fighting in the ghetto. Oh, sorry. And Warsaw Menes writes, there were 30 people in this sweatbox instead of the planned 12, and more people kept arriving from the burning shelters. As I mentioned in the quote from Baruch Goldman, these people were coming together in groups, sometimes in family groups or in political parties or just friend groups, and they were planning on a concrete number of people who would be hiding in a bunker and obviously planning to survive until the end of the war. But as Warsaw Menes writes here, things were not going as planned. And he mentions here these burning shelters. Why were the shelters burning? They were burning because the Germans had changed their tactics and decided that they could not fight the Jewish insurgents in normal battle, and then decided to go house to house and burn every single building down. And here Sebek Okonovsky writes, who would have thought that the German bandits were to set the entire ghetto on fire along with the people hiding in it? And here we have an image from inside the ghetto of a building burning. Warsaw Menes contributes another piece here. The Germans set fire to one house after another, one plot after another. And from an anonymous author, the clothes that people are wearing on fire, people scream in pain and wail. Houses and bunkers are on fire. Everything is aflame. Now, the Germans, being practical people as they are, they also brought in a group of Polish firefighters to make sure that the fire did not spread outside of the ghetto. They wanted to make sure that the ghetto burned, of course. They wanted to catch all of the Jews inside of the ghetto, but they didn't want to make this spread outside to the rest of the city. So as it turned out, there was one firefighter named Zbigniew Grzywaczewski, who was very sympathetic to the Jewish cause. He was in fact hiding Jews himself and helping them. And when he was called upon to go inside the ghetto as a firefighter, he decided to bring along his camera with him and take pictures. And as I mentioned before, almost all of the images that we have really of the Holocaust, but especially of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, come from the perspective of the German perpetrators. And so it's really, really quite unique and quite valuable that we have these photos from Grzywaczewski. Up until very recently, we knew of about 8 pictures that he had taken. There were only 8 that we knew about, and the number of other photographs that we had from this period that were not taken by the Germans really could be counted on one hand. But in preparation for our temporary exhibition at the POLIN Museum, our curator, Zuzanna Schnepf-Kołacz, she was in contact with Grzywaczewski's son. And she kept on asking him over and over and over, have you looked at everything that's in your father's stuff? Are you sure that's all there was? Were there only 8 pictures? There must be more. And finally, Grzywaczewski's son looked in the last box that he hadn't touched since his father had passed, and he found there a roll of undeveloped film. And that roll of film contained 33 new photographs. And so I'm going to share some of those photographs with you, but the entire collection of photographs is really only available if you come to Poland and you see the temporary exhibition yourself and you experience it and see the rest of these photos. So here are a couple of these photos, and I want to contrast these also with the German photographs that are essentially German propaganda, the German perspective on this event. So here are two of the photos, rather innocent looking, but there are important differences here. So on the left side, we have the Polish firefighters seen here with an engine, and on the right side, we can see the firefighters again and a pile of Singer sewing machines. Now, why would a pile of Singer sewing machines be a striking image for someone to take a picture of? That is because in this particular environment, having access to a sewing machine could be the difference between life and death in the ghetto. Having a purpose and having a job that the Germans valued would be the difference between having permission to live another day or being killed. And now contrast those with these pictures from the Stroop report, from the Nazi version of events, where we have these the German soldiers on the left side watching the buildings burn, inspecting their work, and on the right side we have SS officers having a meeting discussing what plans they would hatch next. Meanwhile, within the ghetto, people continued to struggle and continued to try to survive. Adolf Polishuk writes, "Under the cover of night, we would go down into the abandoned shelters, those that have already been discovered, to search for food. On the way, we would meet many people looking for their relatives, for shelter or for food. Strange faces, looking deranged, dirty, clad in rags, physically and mentally exhausted." And on the outside of the ghetto, there were a number of Jews who were living under false identities, and they were looking at these events and having to deal with it, both emotionally and physically. So Szymon Grixman writes, "The stench of burning is spreading across the adjacent quarters of the city. After a few weeks, the whole of Warsaw is saturated with dust and soot. At night, the burning ghetto, akin to a huge bloodshot eye, gazes toward the city and awaits rescue in vain." And I have here a photograph, another photograph that was not taken by the Germans, but by a Polish photographer who owned a photography studio, and he got up on top of his building at night and took this picture of the burning ghetto. And I think that it fits well with the text here. Henryk Rudnicki was another a Jewish gentleman who was also living under a false identity and dealing with the fact of the uprising while he was on the outside. And he writes, "I went out to the city center to look at the burning ghetto. The first thing that caught my attention were the merry-go-rounds jammed with people. Crowds bubbling with excitement and curiosity rushed from all corners of the city to watch the burning district." And this is a particularly striking image of people enjoying themselves. You can imagine on a Saturday afternoon in spring and having a fun time at the merry-go-round. Meanwhile, on the other side of the wall, the ghetto is burning. And there was certainly a lot of anger from Rudnicki's side to have this, and certainly a lot of angst directed at the Poles in particular for their apathy or perhaps their sympathy with this. From the inside of the ghetto, Marylka was a diarist who we don't know that much about, but her diary was left at Majdanek, was found at Majdanek, I should say, and she had this to say: "Behind the red wall, there is yet another wall, a thick wall of indifference and lack of consideration that Poles have built around themselves. If the attitude of Poles toward us, oppressed and persecuted to death, had been different, a significant percentage of us would have survived." And we can really feel her anger and frustration in this. She was hiding in a bunker and thinking about how her former Polish neighbors had let it come to this. Meanwhile, there was the official attitude from the Polish underground. Here is a piece from the Polish Home Army, which was the official underground that was controlled by the government in exile in London. And they write, "The hitherto passive death of the Jewish masses did not create new values. It was useless. Death in battle can bring new values to the life of the Jewish people, giving the ordeal of the Jews in Poland the radiance of a valiant struggle for the right to live." This is how the Warsaw public understood the defense of the ghetto, listening with appreciation to the crackling of the defenders' salvos and anxiously following the lunges and fumes of the ever-widening fires. The fighting citizens of the Polish state from behind the ghetto wall became closer, more comprehensible to the society of the capital. And on the one hand, this is a supportive statement. Of course, the Polish Home Army is saying we support the ghetto fighters, but on the other hand, there is a judgment here. It is saying until the point at which Jews picked up a gun, then we did not understand their plight and we did not sympathize with it. From London, Władysław Sikorski gave a radio address that was broadcast, and anybody who surreptitiously had a radio would have been able to hear. He said, "I am asking you to give them any help you can, and at the same time for you to end this terrible atrocity." You may ask what support was given by the Poles, and we can get into that in the Q&A. But essentially, it was not enough. But there's a longer story there. But getting back to what was happening inside the ghetto, this is a photograph again from the Grzywaczewski collection, and we'll talk about this more in detail. But from Marian Berland, he writes, "Long columns of Jews are passing at short intervals, hundreds of victims from the burnt down houses, half-deranged folk, burnt hair, clothes in tatters, wounded and beaten up. They are floating towards their final resting place." So the thousands of Jews were captured during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Most of them were brought to Majdanek. Very few of them, very few of the people who were captured managed to survive, almost no one. And the people who did survive were the ones who managed to escape from the ghetto and carry on. And we'll talk about a couple of examples of that. But first, so getting back to the Grzywaczewski collection, these are some more photographs from the Polish firefighter. And you can see how these images taken from up inside of a building quite well match with the account that we have from Marian Berland. I want to share with you particularly this photo, which I think is one of the most striking from the entire collection. Here in the center, we have this woman looking back, the child there on the right also looking back from where they've come, people being carried by their loved ones or their friends, really broken people. And compare this to the German images like this one. Do these people look starving to you? Do these people look like they're ragged? Do they look like they've been burned? No. They look well put together. They look well fed. The little girl on the right even has a matching outfit. This does not comport with the reality. And I think that we should all be a little bit more wary when we're using these German images and try to think about what propaganda purpose they were serving. And of course, this image also comes from the same report. It's this is the namesake of the report. Jürgen Stroop here is pictured in the middle. He's the third person from the left right there. He was the leader of the SS group that was destroying the ghetto. And after the war, he was put on trial first by the Americans for his role in killing American POWs, and then extradited to Poland, put on trial in Poland, and hung in 1952. But before that point, he was still leading the destruction of the ghetto. And by mid-May, on May 16th, 1943, he decided that even fewer and fewer people were being captured or killed in the ghetto. And so he decided to call an end to his operation in the ghetto. And to celebrate this moment, Jürgen Stroop took a bunch of explosives and strapped them to this fantastic synagogue that was in the middle of Warsaw and turned it into this. And in fact, all of the ghetto had turned into rubble. As you can see, this is an aerial photograph of the ghetto, and the destruction was nearly total. And I want you to take note of the building there that's in the background. You can see that it seems to be a building straight there, but it's actually just a facade. And that was the prison inside the Warsaw Ghetto. It was also the home of the Jewish Council. And it's an important landmark for reasons that we'll get to in a moment. But inside the rubble, amazingly, people continued to live. And here's one example of that from Leon Nyberg. He writes, "I have been accepted to a combat unit called the Rubblers. The group is made up of 25 young Jewish boys. The arms at our disposal are 4 FBV's pistols, 1 Colt, 3 FN pistols, 2 cylinder guns, and 8 grenades. Our task is to defend unarmed Jews who are still in the rubble, self-defense, and finally, to fight the informants. Leon Nyberg was an unbelievable figure. He was just 17 years old when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began. Up to that point, he had managed to survive by working in a factory, and then he decided to join the fight and took active part in the Ghetto Uprising. He survived, then moved on to the so-called Aryan side in September, and he fought in the Warsaw Uprising in August of 1944. He survived that too. And then he moved on to Israel in 1949, where he had several children, 3 children, 12 grandchildren, and he even lived long enough to meet 11 of his great-grandchildren. So truly, truly amazing person. He just passed away in 2009. Krystyna Budnicka, or Henna Kucher, she was born Henna Kucher. She had also managed to survive so many trials and tribulations, and amazingly, her family really managed to stay together through all of these different phases of the Holocaust. And she was the youngest child of 7, actually, and several of her brothers had managed to escape the transports to Treblinka. They were fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but by the end of the uprising, she was left with her one of her sisters and her parents, and they were escaping through the sewers in September. And she writes, "We spent 2 days sitting on planks in the sewers. It turned out that our manhole was soldered shut. We had to go to another manhole. My parents didn't have the energy to do it. They stopped walking. My 23-year-old sister, Pola, stopped too, not willing to leave our parents alone. They stayed in the sewers forever." And Krystyna Budnicka, or Henna Kucher, as she was known then, she was just 11 years old, and she exited the sewers, found her way to a convent, and was raised in an orphanage by nuns. She changed her name to Krystyna Budnicka, and she spent the rest of her life in Poland, and she was a school teacher. She's still with us, and she was taking part today in the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. She was there for the ceremony. She's been taking part in many, many commemorations, giving interviews and talking with people. A truly, truly amazing person. At the end here, I just want to talk about how the uprising has been commemorated. And getting back to that facade of a building I showed you before in that picture of the rubble, on the left side, that's that same building, the building where the Jewish Council was and where the ghetto prison was. And now this photograph is from 1946. And it's showing you people building a monument. And as you can see, there was rubble everywhere. The rest of the city was basically destroyed in 1944 after the Warsaw Uprising. And you can imagine how many things people could be doing with their energy and their resources. But what are people doing? They're building a monument to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising already for this first anniversary, or rather third anniversary, but for the first time that they would be able to commemorate it. And this is what that monument looks like. 2 years later, this monument was put up, much more grand monument, and probably much more familiar to many of you. It has been the site of many famous activities, and such as Willy Brandt's Kniefall, his apology on behalf of the German nation, and many, many ceremonies, including the one that happened today. And obviously, there were sites, and there are many sites in Poland where people can commemorate death and can commemorate the victims of the Holocaust, these heroes who fought in the ghetto. But there was no place to talk about all of the richness of Jewish life that existed for hundreds of years in this place, and then was destroyed during the Holocaust, up until the museum that I work for, the POLIN Museum, was opened in 2013 and 2014, and it is located directly across from this monument. It's located on the same spot where that building was that I mentioned before, that was the ghetto prison and the home of the Jewish Council. So essentially the center of the ghetto. And the POLIN Museum is a monument to Jewish life and not just to Jewish death. So thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much for that, Zachary. I personally learned a lot, and I think our audience did too. We have lots of questions coming in. So I'm going to start sort of from the earliest part of your presentation. The driver who took the photos that you showed at the beginning, um, why was he given a permit to drive through the ghetto? Do we know why he was able to do that?
I don't know. He must have had some business reason to do that,
Gotcha.
but I
And
really don't know what the story is with that. It also could have just been bribery, because something that is not talked about a lot is that Germans were quite easy to bribe, apparently.
gotcha. And do you know, you also showed the picture of the child who was pushed by the Polish police officer
Mhm.
because he was caught smuggling. Do we know what would happen to children who were caught smuggling? Sort of, were they punished? Do we know anything about what would happen to them?
Some were punished, but a lot of times it was solved by greasing palms.
Gotcha.
But there wasn't it was not as if the kids would be imprisoned
Mhm.
very, very rarely.
Okay. So then you mentioned that when the Warsaw Ghetto, at the start of the Warsaw Ghetto, there was approximately 450,000 Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto. How many were left at the time of the uprising, and how many of them actively participated in the uprising?
Okay, so a small correction. There were 450,000 Jews at the height of the population of the ghetto, but by the time we get to 42 and the summer of 42, many people had died already of disease and starvation. So that number was considerably lower, but probably about 350,000 Jews were left in the ghetto. So that was the summer of 1942. Then when we get to the end of the Great Deportation Action, there were approximately 50,000. That's kind of the high number. It's between 30 and 50,000 Jews who were left in the ghetto. And that would be the amount that was left by the time the uprising happened in April 43. And how many fought? It's quite hard to say how many fought, but it's between 1,000 and 2,000 actually fought. And this was not because there were only a small number of people who were willing to fight, but the issue really was about getting weapons. It was difficult to get weapons. As I mentioned, this issue with relationship with the Polish underground, there was not much of a willingness from the Polish underground to give them a large stock of weapons.
I see. Okay. So you also mentioned that people were starving, really struggling to get food, but in the bunkers they were stocking food before the uprising.
Yes.
So you mentioned that during the uprising they would go into already burned out shelters to look for food, but where were they getting food beforehand? Was that also a kind of bribery situation, or
Yeah,
was there other
it was
ways?
all just smuggling business. So there were Polish delivery people and Polish farmers who were making a lot of money essentially on this smuggling business.
Okay. And we have kind of a lot of questions that I'm going to combine a bit into one, but can you talk more? You said maybe we could talk more about this during the Q&A. So more about like the response of non-Jewish Poles to the uprising, and especially if there were any Polish allies to the Nazis, how like what their role was in the uprising and trying to put the uprising down.
Sure. So there obviously the responses from non-Jewish Poles, from Catholic Poles was varied. Obviously, this is an individual kind of situation, and people responded in different ways. There were plenty of people within the Polish underground that were supportive of the Jewish fighters, that wanted to give them more weapons. But ultimately, there was a supreme commander of the Home Army, and he made the decision that he thought was a practical decision that the Jews would die anyway. And so giving them the weapons might be the technically right thing to do, but it would be also a wasteful thing to do, because they would die anyway. That was the explanation that they gave. There were a couple of attempts by the Polish Home Army to blow up the ghetto wall, that both failed. And blowing up the wall really would have been symbolic help anyway, because it was not hard for people to get out of the ghetto. The issue was, what do you do once you're outside the ghetto? You needed a place to hide, you needed people to support you, and you needed money to buy food and to buy shelter, essentially. So all those things are really the main issue. There are questions also about Polish collaborators. There were a small number of Polish police officers who took part in the clearing of the ghetto. This was not a major group of people. There were these Polish police, but I would not call them allies of the Germans. There was just a police force that was part of this.
Okay. So why were the Jews who were captured during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising sent to Majdanek and not Treblinka?
Because Treblinka at that point had stopped its activity. That's the simple answer to that.
Gotcha. And we're getting some questions about, what is the response to the uprising today among Poles, and how is it taught, how is it viewed today?
Yeah, so in large part because of the museum that I work for, I think things have changed a lot over the past 10, 15 years. So one thing that we've done for 11 years now is lead a campaign of awareness about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where people are handing out these paper daffodils and people wear them all over the country, and school children make them. And we did a survey back in 2013 asking people if they were even aware of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Only 30% of people knew about it. We repeated that survey in 2018, and that number was 80%. So people are much more aware of it. And in fact, I think that there's some attempt, or some attempt is the wrong word, but some movement towards making the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising part of Polish identity and integrating it into how people think about their own history. And in fact, the speech that the Polish president gave today at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising commemoration was very much in that vein. It was, this is our history, and these are our fighters. I can understand that some people might take this as saying, oh, this is stolen valor, now you're trying to say that they're Poles. But I think it's on the more generous side of this, we can see that there is an attempt to say these are Poles of Jewish faith, and trying to integrate them into a more inclusive version of Polish identity, rather than excluding them and saying, well, there's Poles and then there's Jews, right?
Gotcha. So we're having some more questions that are coming in now about, and I don't know if you know any information about this, but do you know about the US's responses to the uprising, and if there was any awareness in the United States at the time of it?
Yes, there was awareness. I mean, this is an interesting question that opens up another avenue, because there is always a lot of anger directed at Poles for their let's say apathy towards the Holocaust, but often people forget about how apathetic the United States was to the fate of the Jews prior to the war, also, when they actually could have done something, such as accepting many refugees. They refused to. So there was, of course, awareness of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but there was little that was done. And this is actually in contrast to 1944, when the Warsaw Uprising happened, there were airdrops coming from Britain. There were American planes that were involved in that, but these were planes that were originating in Britain and in Italy as well, and dropping materials, dropping guns and equipment and food to help the Warsaw Uprising. But the same thing did not happen for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Gotcha. And this is something I was actually really curious about as well. And you talked about how the photo with the women and the child and sort of the matching outfit is a German propaganda photo. So was that faked? Were those people actually living in the ghetto?
We don't know. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of the photos that are part of the Stroop report were staged.
Mm-hmm.
And that particular photo also could have been staged. There's a great film called A Film Unfinished is the name of the documentary film, and it's about a Nazi documentary that was being made about the ghetto that was never actually made, but somebody found all the raw footage, and from the raw footage,
wow,
you can see how all of these shots were being staged. And they all have a purpose, and it's quite upsetting to me, frankly, that a lot of people, a lot of museums, including Yad Vashem, they use these images from these films without any comment or without any kind of explanation of why these things are the way they are. And in many cases, they're showing images that are meant to evoke certain responses. Such as showing Jews all crowded together walking across that bridge. It's a famous image that I'm sure you've seen, right? Walking across the bridge in the Warsaw Ghetto. And they staged that. I staged that so that people would look at it and think of Jews not as human beings, but like rats, but like vermin, being pushed across in this little tunnel, right? So there's an image that's being created by the Nazi propagandists, and we need to be a little bit more critical of those images. I'm not saying we can't use them, but I think they always need to have some kind of comment and be clearly marked as like, this is a German Nazi photograph, and not just accepting it as like, well, here is a real image from the Warsaw Ghetto. I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that.
Yeah. So we're also getting a lot of questions about people asking, they have relatives who survived the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the Warsaw Ghetto, and they are kind of asking where they can find more information about the uprising, about people who were in the ghetto. Is there any resources that you can recommend?
There's a couple of things that I can recommend. On the Warsaw Ghetto in general, there is an encyclopedic book called it's called Guide to a Perished City. And it is edited by Barbara Engelking. It was originally published in Polish, but it was republished in English by Yale University Press. I think it's out of print, but it could probably be found in any library. And in terms of other resources for the ghetto, I would also check the website of the Center for Holocaust Research in Poland. It's run by the Polish Academy of Sciences, and they have a long ongoing project all about the ghetto. This is a continuation of that same project that produced that book, but there's a website with all kinds of resources on there.
Awesome. So we are at the end of the hour, but I do want to make sure that I ask this. This is the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So what do you think is the most important thing that we can take from, your presentation, the research that you're doing, the exhibition that you have at your museum? What is the most important lesson that we can kind of take from this in our current moment? I know it's kind of a big question.
Yeah, big question. I mean, I I think there's two things that we can take away. One I think is that we should be inspired by these stories, that people continued to fight, that people continued to resist, continued to essentially assert their own humanity.
Mhm.
And that should be inspiring for all of us, that there's, there are bigger things. Sometimes we get down on on our own lives and get worried about little things, but I think this kind of stuff puts things in perspective. And the other part of it is just a general lesson on the Holocaust, which is less, in my view, is less about ideologies. It's not about anti-Semitism is politics, right? Anti-Semitism is a way to get people behind a cause. But the actual point at which people do these really evil things, they're not necessarily thinking about anti-Semitism. People are doing evil things to each other because humans have the capacity to do really evil things, and they still do, as we see around the world in many cases. So I think that should be the other lesson, is that we as humans have the ability to do awful things to each other, and that's what we need to be working to stop.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing presentation and for answering all those questions. I know that there's a lot of them. So I really appreciate you being here and doing this with us today, especially on this really, important anniversary. So thank you so much.